Alright, it's time to add an armature and start making this car move. So let's go to front ortho view, shift A, armature, single bone, and I want to move that to this layer here, just so we can toggle these on and off here and isolate it. Let me just isolate that for now. And now that we're going to be talking about armatures, there's actually a lot of complex subjects and theory that go along with creating a rig. Luckily for me, and probably for you too, I don't have to really talk about a lot of that because there's already another tutorial out there that explains it far better than I ever could. So the name of that tutorial is Humane Rigging by Nathan Vegdahl. Nathan Vegdahl is an extremely good rigger and knows Blender inside out. He is one of the main riggers on some of the open movie projects that Blender has done, Big Buck Bunny and Sintel. I believe he was also an animator in there. He was the main rigger and animator for both of those projects, and he's also the author of Rigify. So very skilled guy. And the reason I'm bringing up humane rigging is that's actually where most of my rigging knowledge came from. You can get a copy of Humane Rigging from blender.org, or you can also see some of the chapters right here on YouTube. Please go buy a copy from blender.org, and you won't regret it. And also, side benefit of getting your own copy from the Blender store there is you're going to be helping the development of Blender. So, side benefit, Blender is a free software, but it still needs resources and money to continue its development. So that's going to indirectly help that. So if you're interested in rigging, please buy one. I'll get off my soapbox now here. I don't want to get into that subject too far. But let's get back to humane rigging and talk about that. Nathan, throughout that course, he starts with some pretty simple rigs, and along the way he adds, he brings up a lot of different concepts and theory along the way, and it's the concepts and the theory that I really want you to pay attention to when you're watching that tutorial. Don't do what I did and just kind of skip through and get to the parts that I thought were interesting or the parts that I thought were relevant for whatever I was working at the time. It's actually the theory and the concepts that are going to help you. Adding bones and adding constraints and drivers and things like that, that's actually the easy stuff. Or at least it's going to be the easy stuff after you know the theory behind it all. So, like I said, don't do what I did and kind of skip that. That actually hurt my my education, and it wasn't until I went back and really focused on those issues that I started making strides forward. So, so when I get to those parts, those complex subjects and things, I think I'm just going to point you to that tutorial and tell you you can learn about quaternion and Euler rotations over here from this guy a little bit better. So, like I said, this tutorial is mainly focused on my workflow, so that's really what I want to focus in on. Alright, now we need to talk about the different modes that we're going to be switching through here when we're using our armature. And the first one is object mode, and I'm actually going to delete this armature really quick and do Shift A and just add it back in there. Shift A, single bone. Alright, and this bone, or this armature, is now in object mode, and that's basically the last time we ever have to worry about this mode, which is actually a good thing. We never really want to move it and manipulate it in any other way in object mode. So we can actually, once we add it to our scene, our armature, we can basically forget about that. And you can tell that we're in object mode if by this color. If I have this selected, you can see that it's got a yellowish color. But let's get to actual modes that are gonna, you can see that we have 3 different modes here. Object, edit, and pose. Let's go to edit mode, and you can see that the bone is now orange, and that's a good indicator of what mode we're in. Let's actually just go to pose mode now quickly too, and if you see that it's got this bluish color, then you'll know that we're in pose mode. So let's talk about edit mode and talk about the things that we're going to actually do in edit mode. One of the first things we do is this is the mode that we're going to add new bones to. So like other areas in Blender, if I move my cursor around here and do Shift A, it's going to add a bone there. Alright, so pretty simple. That's the first way we're going to add bones. There's a second option to add bones, and that's if I select one of these bones and do Shift D, that'll duplicate a bone, and we can create bones that way. And yet a third option, if I select one of these vertices, a bone basically is made up of two vertices. If I select one and do E to extrude, it's just like modeling. I can actually extrude a bone. Oops, extrude a bone directly up from another one. One of the things I want to talk about, when we extrude a bone like this, this bone will automatically become a child of the one we extruded it from. So we actually need to go into pose mode to show you that what happens there. And my mouse is giving me a little trouble here. If I just rotate this, you can see that this bone, if I type G to grab it, it won't move because I extruded it from there, and you can see that the location is actually grayed out. So when we extrude a bone, this bone became a child of this one automatically, and it's basically a connected bone. So when I start talking about parenting here, let's go back to let me clear all these locations, rotations. Actually, let me just get rid of a few of these bones here. So that's the other thing that we're going to be doing. In we've got 3 different ways where we can add bones, and then also we're going to be setting up some child and parent relationships here. And that when we extrude, we automatically set that relationship up. If we didn't want that relationship, we could do Alt P, and we could either clear the parent, or we could actually disconnect that bone. Now if I go back to pose mode, remember that location, it wasn't possible to move it before, but now it is. So alright, so parent and child relationships, which is the next main thing we do. And let's set one up here. When I extruded, I had a connected bone, and I'm going to select this as a child and this as the parent, and Control P. I'm going to do keep offset as our next demonstration here. And we need to, if we're in edit mode, we don't see what that relationship is going to be. We need to actually be in pose mode to see what the results are going to be. So just be aware of that. This one is now a child of this, and it's going to move in any place or with it in any direction we want, and rotate and so forth. So parent and child relationships, that's where we're going to set up, and also in edit mode. Alright, let me actually turn on some display options here. Do axes and X-ray. Alright, I'm going to kind of back up here a little bit. Remember earlier when I duplicated a bone? One thing I want to talk about when we duplicate a bone is, let me just duplicate this one. This was a child of this center one here, so let's duplicate it. And you can see that our duplicate actually retained that parent and child relationship. So this bone is now also a child of this bone. And that's what I want you to be aware of when we duplicate a bone. Sometimes duplicating helps us, and sometimes it hinders us, because all the properties that we've already created on a bone before we duplicate it are going to be duplicated across. So in order to show you another example of that, let me just go to pose mode again, and let's just add a constraint. And I actually don't need to configure this. You can see that it turned green. Let's go back to edit mode, and I'm going to duplicate this one that had that constraint on it. So you can see the parenting is being duplicated, and also that constraint got duplicated across. And if we would have set some of these axis locks or something like that, or added drivers or custom properties and things, anything that we would have added as far as a property would have been duplicated too. So I just want you to be aware of that behavior. Sometimes that helps our situation, and sometimes it can actually hinder it and make more work for us. So as we're adding bones, the method we use, whether to add a cursor, or to extrude it, or to just duplicate it, it's kind of, it's pretty ambiguous, and once you do a lot of rigging or get into it a little bit, it'll be a lot easier to make those decisions. So, and we briefly were in pose mode here, and what we can do in pose mode, this is mainly our animation mode, and this is what our animators are going to use to manipulate our rigs. But for riggers, it's also important because that is where we're going to add our bone constraints, and we're going to add our drivers and custom properties and things like that. And I don't want to get too far into that subject because it can actually get pretty complicated pretty quick. So let me get everything back into default. Let's delete this. Alright. Now I want to kind of go over a few odd things that you're going to find here, and hopefully I can kind of end some confusion before you get confused. You see when I turn down that axis display, at the top here you can see the local axis of this bone, and these 2 points that make up this bone are always going to be the length of this bone. It's always going to be the y-axis, or the local y-axis. So if I type GYY to get local axis of the bone, you can see it's always going to be along that length. And you can also see that our y for the world is this direction. So when we're animators are always going to be animating in local space. So GYY. So I just want you to keep that in mind when we're moving things. When we move a bone in pose mode, we're almost always going to be moving everything or rotating something around its local axis. So, and since we're talking about axes here, let me show you a little oddity here. If I rotate this bone, it's rotating down here, and this is actually the head of the bone. You see up in the transform panel when I manipulate it, the head position is moving, and this is the tail. And this display option is actually, I think, is displaying on the wrong end of the bone. The important end of the bone is always the head, and that's why you'll see me stay in octahedral mode. There's many different display options here. I like to stay in octahedral mode because this fat end always shows me where the head of the bone is, and the head of the bone is like I said, the important end. It's the end that's going to rotate around, and it's also the end. This location value is here, not up here. So just wanted to point that out. Be aware of that. I think if this display was down here, it would actually be a little bit more helpful, but just be aware of it. I don't want you to get too confused. Alright, the last thing I want to talk about, I think, is basically I like to categorize the bones that I'm adding to my armature in 3 main categories. The first one will be control bones, and that is what the animator is going to use. Our animator is going to basically manipulate those bones through either rotation or location or scale, and those are the bones that they're going to be animating. And so we got control bones, and those control bones will actually probably be moving some mechanism bones, and there'll be some bones behind the scenes that are doing some interesting things to basically ultimately move the last set of bones, which are our deformation bones. So 3 sets of bones. We've got our controls. I like to think of these as our input from our animator, and then we've got mechanism bones that do all the things behind the scene. But ultimately, what those mechanism bones do when the animator inputs the controls and the rotations and things, is they ultimately move our deformation bones, and our deformation bones are the bones that move our object meshes. And it can be simple things like simply having objects parented to bones, or it could be complex, like actually deforming that mesh. So those are the 3 main categories, and I want you to kind of keep in mind: control bones, mechanism bones, and deformation bones. Now in our next part, we're actually going to start our whole rig with our deformation bones, because I want to start thinking about how everything's going to move, and that's actually going to be a little bit it's actually going to feel like we've gotten somewhere, or we're getting somewhere. So let's get to that next part and start creating our rig.